Hi everybody, welcome. As people who build software together, as developers, as testers, as managers, we are skeptical, rightly so, of claims of shortcuts to quality. Right? If we could all just swipe our credit cards and see like an overnight 10x improvement in some quality metric we care about, we wouldn't all be here learning how to do this better. So there is some good news though, even if there aren't shortcuts to quality, there are at least paths to quality. There are ways that we can get dramatic improvements to things like bug count for one. And of course, one of those techniques is code review. We'll be talking about that one today. So how many of y'all are doing code review on your teams or in your organizations? Show of hands. All right, for the teams that haven't yet incorporated this or have maybe tried it and had it not work out well for them, a lot of the things I see are boiled down to either time or culture, right? Code review can be time consuming and expensive to do. It's also can be a coordination problem if you want people to get together synchronously and sit in a room together the way our calendars look these days. And then culturally, I've seen code reviews devolve into arguing about what color to paint the bike shed, right? How far to indent things and kind of missing the overall point, and people end up squabbling. So for the folks who are not regularly doing code review, does either one of those ring true or resonate for y'all? Or is there some other reason that code review has not worked out well in your organizations? So time and culture, does that kind of resonate? So the bad news is that these are still obstacles to code review, even once your organizations get in the habit of doing it. But the good news is there are ways to address them. And today's talk will be kind of a grab bag of stories and tools and tips and techniques on addressing either time issues, that is scalability issues, or culture issues, that is humanity issues in code review and getting that adopted. So my hope is that for the folks who have not rolled this out or have rolled it out and it didn't work, that there's something in today's presentation that makes you think, oh, I'll give that a try, maybe this will improve our odds. Or for the teams that are already doing code review, maybe you'll see something like, oh, that's cool, we could try that. But what I'm really hoping is that people hear these techniques and go and think of something totally new, something that I didn't mention here, something that just got the creative juices flowing in our brains. All right, before we move on, I'll say a quick word about me. I work at New Relic. We do web performance management. We write and maintain a big Ruby app. I wrote a book about that. Does anybody use Ruby or RSpec here? Cool, a few people. So any of the Ruby RSpec users, I'm giving away this copy. It's called Effective Testing with RSpec 3. So if you're interested in it, just raise your hand anytime during the presentation, ask a question and mention that you want the Ruby book and it's yours. All right. So why do we do code review? I hope I don't have to sell y'all too hard on the idea of doing code review, but it's worth spending a few moments to do so. The number one thing I think about is bug count, right? When I did a survey of 100 imaginary people in my head and I asked them, why did they do code review? The number one answer, reduce bugs. And there's a great book by Robert Glass called Facts and Fallacies of Software Engineering. It's written in the 90s, I believe. I love this book because it's written in such a curmudgeonly style. Like, you kids don't know what you're doing with software these days. And it's so great because it's such a counterpoint to my own chirpy optimism. Like, every new thing is shiny and awesome. Let's do it. And even this pessimistic curmudgeon, or at least writing in a curmudgeonly style author, has done a meta review of all the studies and seen even the most pessimistic views that code review can remove 60% of defects. That's the most pessimistic view. And if we could all do something that would take out 2/3 of our defects, that would be pretty darn amazing. The most optimistic view, by the way, in the studies he reviewed, and he did not consider them unrealistic, was 90%. So 90% is a 10-to-1 reduction in bug count. That's just about getting into silver bullet territory. Has anybody read The Mythical Man Month by Fred Brooks? Right, the story of building the operating system for the IBM 360 back in the 70s, and saying that there aren't, we should really be skeptical of any silver bullets, alleged silver bullets in software. Anything that claims an instant 10-to-1 improvement. And by the way, the title of that book, Mythical Man Month, comes from this idea that we can just make a project faster by throwing more engineers at it. Just like cooking a turkey faster by doubling the temperature in the oven. Works just as well. So the thing about silver bullets, of course, they're made from silver, and silver's really expensive. Maybe code review is too expensive to justify even a 10-to-1 review, or sorry, 10-to-1 reduction. But there are, of course, other reasons to do code review. So folks that are doing code review, what are some of the other benefits y'all have seen besides reduced bug count?
Just getting better at writing code.
Getting better at writing code. I love it.
Enforcement of standards.
Enforcement of standards.
Avoiding silos.
Avoiding silos, so keeping knowledge distributed throughout the team.
Improve maintainability.
Improved maintainability. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, when we test, we don't really see the quality of the code. So when people do peer review, they also improve maintainability of the code because it's going to be easy to make a change later if the structure, right?
Okay, so I'm going to rephrase the camera. So, because everybody's eyes are on it, they can make sure that it's structured in a way that makes it maintainable?
Yeah.
All right.
Enforced process.
Enforced process. I love it. Y'all have hit, I brainstormed this pretty darn hard. Y'all hit most of the things I came up with. One of them is CYA. If you have some kind of process or perhaps even legal regulation, if you deal with financial or perhaps health record code, you might be legally required to supply evidence that you reviewed code. That's not the #1 reason I would do it, but it was on there. Another one is recognition. We have new team members and they're looking to advance their careers and they've made meaningful contributions to the software. This is great evidence that they are improving the quality of your system. And let's get our teammates recognized and cheered on. And I'll talk about one more thing, serendipity. I'll tell a story that I was about to have to write some queries against one of our internal APIs that I'd never used as an API before, and I wasn't quite sure how to do it. And just by coincidence, a friend of mine tagged me in on a code review, which is completely unrelated to what I was doing, but it happened to be the part of the code that queries that system. And I'm like, sweet, now I know how to query this thing. This is awesome. And it was just a total coincidence, but the more you code review, the more these kinds of happy coincidences happen. All right, so we've talked about why we code review and what we get out of it. I'd like to talk about what kind of code review we're talking about. Because there's the sort of classic model of code review, and certainly the model that Glass was talking about, the very formal, structured code review, right? The picture is you have a meeting room, and you have half a dozen people in there, and everybody's got a very narrowly defined role. You could be the moderator, and your job is to keep the meeting moving. You could be the recorder, and your job is to write down everything everybody says. You could be the author, and this is the worst, because some of the models I've heard of this, your job as the author of the code is to sit there and not say anything other than the words "thank you." So you could have somebody just eviscerate that module you just wrote, and their criticism might not even be technically correct, and all you can do is, "Thank you, thanks a lot, it's great." And it's not great for the participants either because they're expected to have done their homework and already read your code and come to the meeting with a bunch of ideas and criticism to share. So really they're reviewing it twice. It's a pretty slow process. And again, I don't know, my calendar kind of looks like I'm just about to lose at Tetris. And if your other engineers on that team have that same issue, then just even getting that many people together in a room is going to be logistically really difficult, let alone committing an hour of everyone's time in the meeting plus a couple hours to read the code beforehand. So this is slow and it's synchronous and it's restrictive and it demands so much of us. And it can be rancorous. There were a couple of stories in the Glass book about, or actually in one of the papers cited in it, more on that later, about teams sort of degenerating into arguing about trivial things. And some of that was because people didn't come prepared. And some of that was just because we're humans and that's what we do. So these things can be homework filled and rancorous and just, even though they can be effective, they can cost us so much, both in scalability, because I claim getting that many people together that often for that amount of time does not scale as our organizations get faster, but it can also be less humane. All right, I mentioned the paper about teams squabbling about details. That was actually one of many topics mentioned there. The paper's by Rifkin and Daimel. And it was about, are there ways to do code review with less formality? Or actually, the topic of the paper was, are there ways to do better code review? But it turns out, like the answer was, well, we don't need all the formality. What they found out was that teaching code comprehension to their teams, how to read code, was hugely valuable. They got, at least on one of their little squiggly graphs, they got about a 10-to-1 reduction in defects just from a team intentionally practicing reading the code well. That's something I think we could get better at. I think we could teach our engineers better when they come in the front door how to comprehend code. And there's a good article by Alan Skorkin, on how he comprehends code sort of one module at a time. I'll dig up a link for anybody who wants to come up after and show that to you. But he talks about how he goes multiple passes through the code at different levels of details. He sort of does deep dive spikes on individual bits and pieces. Again, this is not a talk on code comprehension. I would go watch that talk. Any of y'all want to pitch that for next year, you've got my vote. But the point is that that was the important thing. Reading the code with care and intention was what got the result, not the formality. And by the way, so this paper was cited by Glass as evidence that rigor is more important than formalism. I did actually read the original paper too. You should never go to a conference and start citing a paper that you haven't actually read all the way through. That's how we got waterfall. Have you all heard this story? Okay, awesome. I love this story. I mean, I'll turn up the dramatic value of it just a little bit here. But basically, there was this paper back in 1960 by Royce. Yes, I've read that one too, about different methodologies for software development. They were looking to standardize on it, like what's a good way for large-scale software development. And he came up with this design that had a lot of feedback from different steps, the requirements gathering and testing and writing the code. And there was lots of interplay between these steps, lots of iteration. But he started the paper with this diagram that goes requirements, design, code, test, release. And then on the next page, he says, but don't do that. The exact words, I wrote it down for the paper, risky and invites failure. Those are Royce's words for the paper. And I don't know how that don't do that picture got enshrined as the way we're supposed to do it. Maybe somebody just read the first couple of pages, but oh, there's the diagram. Looks good to me, ship it. I imagine that's the way it is. I don't have any evidence that's the way it is, but it sure makes for a funny story, except we ended up with waterfall. So anyway, always read a paper you're going to cite in a conference as evidence of something. Back to the Rifkin and Daimel paper about the importance of care, the importance of attention, right? So rigor, in the sense that Glass means it, of giving a darn about what we're doing, is more important than having a formal meeting. Incidentally, the other thing they trained their teams to do was write their own code review checklists. So if, like, there's one thing y'all do today, checklists, add them to your code review process. All right, so how do we make things scale then? What are some code review techniques and methods that we can use that can be scalable and humane? The ones I'm going to be talking about today are sort of the pull request model, right? The sort of GitHubs, GitLab, Stash style code review where you commit your code on a branch, you go to a web-based tool, you open up a request and you invite people to come read your change, and then at some point it gets merged in. This is not the only way to do scalable humane code review. It's just something we can hang our ideas on. We talk about PRs and automation, and we can abbreviate the or for email, do it this way, and for other tools, do it this way. But there are lots of other ways to get these results. Another, just like sort of brainstorming, you can email patches around to each other and still get the benefits of asynchronous review, get the benefits of frequent comment back and forth, of enforcing standards, of teaching new engineers, of maintainability. You can get that by emailing diffs around. So don't get hung up on the tools. Start somewhere. All right, so this pull request model, when I can get an invite in my inbox and I can review the code on my own terms, on my own time, it's asynchronous. People in different time zones review my code. I love it. It invites discussion, right? You have this nice comment form where you can inject personality and humor into the process, which we'll find out later is really important. And it encourages follow-up. You can actually take follow-up items and do the things that people asked of you. The pull request model makes that really easy to surface by adding things like, again, checklists, by adding things like links to follow-up tickets in your bug tracking system. There are lots of ways that you can ensure that your reviewers' recommendations actually get acted on. And then finally, the pull request model, again, along with many other models, supports automation. As we're going to see, automating something is a great way to improve both scalability and, ironically, humanity. So when I talk about automation, I'm talking about things like continuous integration, right? You don't have to have a human being kick off your automated level tests. I'm also talking about things like enforcing style. right? You can do that through the tools and not put all of that burden on the human reviewers. And finally, automation can help you decide who should review this code. That gets into this notion of roles. So there are lots of ways to do this, but here at New Relic, we've got this bot that watches all of our pull requests, and it will have little conversations with you in line in the pull request. And it can also kick off other tools like the build or like a smoke test or like boot a little copy of the app running just your version of the code, things like that. So the robot is there to answer questions. And these are just some of the types of questions that your robots can answer for you. Did the test pass? That's the easy one, right? Does the app boot? The old smoke check. I don't know if y'all knew this, but all of our electronic devices are powered by magic smoke that lives inside the chips. And that's why if you've ever seen an electronic device emit smoke and it doesn't work anymore, that's because you let the magic smoke out and it doesn't work. So the smoke test, boot the app and does it at least come up and let you log in? Did I leave in any debugging code? One of the very, very, very few things I miss about a C++ IDE is the ability to like click and set a breakpoint and not have that be part of the code. In Ruby, you actually have to add a new line of code saying binding.pry. It's easy to commit those by mistake. The robot can catch that. Are we legally allowed to deploy this code? Did I accidentally like bring in code that's using a license that our lawyers have said, no, you can't do that? Did I make a dumb mistake in this code? Another story time. In many languages, including in Ruby, including the ones y'all are familiar with, a single equals is an assignment, and two equals signs together is a comparison. People are already nodding. You know what I committed to production. You know what made it all the way to production. It was a single equals in place of a double equals. Fortunately, it was in a pretty minor navigation part of our setup and not like the main page or giving everybody admin access or anything like that. But it was still kind of embarrassing. And you know what the first thing I did after I fixed that problem in production was I added in a static time check to check for those particular places that the equals assignment was hiding in at the end of a line of code where it was easy to miss in a review. And so we added a static check saying, nope, that very narrow case where you're allowed to put assignment inside a conditional is not allowed at the end of the line. Did I commit any tabs? Or if you're a tab shop, did I commit any spaces? Whatever you choose is fine, just please don't mix them in the same file. That's just, has anybody seen a file get committed to revision control where some of the lines are tabs and some are spaces because everybody's editor's configured differently, and then you open it in yours and the lines are all like that? What bug does this change fix? Right, you can have the tools ensure that your branch name or your bug description contains a link to your Jira ticket or your Bugzilla ticket or whatever you're using. One that occurred to me today while I was going back over these notes, did QA review this? That's a great question for the robot to answer. Your QA people can tell you, no, you can't disable that API. I know it doesn't look like a lot of people are using it, but our testing tools rely on it. And finally, and more pertinently to the idea of roles, the robot can answer the question, who all should review this code? So this no longer becomes a meeting that you have to manually set up and organize with people. It becomes something that just happens. All right, before I get into roles, I'm going to take a little break, have a sip of tea, and because I forgot to earlier, I'm going to show you the legalese slide, which our lawyers have asked me to do. You don't have to read it. Please don't read it. It basically just says, we're a publicly traded company. Please do not accept stock tips from people, strangers at conferences. So, yeah, that's pretty much it for the slides. Now we have something much nicer to look at. Anybody have any questions? Well, yes?
So you may be getting this later in your presentation, but with pull requests, I get something in my inbox for reviews to go.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of negates or takes the place of collaborative code reviews. That look sort of the synergistic value of having two people look at code together versus I'm in my cubicle, you're in your cubicle, and we don't get that value. Do you guys have a solution for that, or does it think that it's kind of being unnecessary?
Sure. So Jeremiah's question for the cameras. What about missing out on those opportunities to do face-to-face code review together? I'm going to touch on that in a little bit. what we tend to do, for one thing, there's a whole lot of back and forth in our comments in the pull review, and we do that by injecting humor and personality and lots of animated images. And but also there will be a time when there are enough comments back and forth where we'll say, wait a minute, this could be an in-person conversation, and we'll shift to IRL, or perhaps like the middle ground to Slack, right? And you're totally right. We don't want to throw out the face-to-face interaction with the bathwater, right? We just don't want it to be a requirement for every review, because not every review, I claim, needs a face-to-face interaction. But you're absolutely right. We do need to continue to make room for them. All right, I want to talk a little bit about roles, because this was kind of a nice revelation to me in a couple of different teams I've had. So I used to work at Tektronix. We've got a couple of Tektronix people here, perhaps. Yay! All right, y'all just came out with a Series 5 oscilloscope. That thing's beautiful. Congratulations! I'm honored to have had a teeny tiny part in its creation. The team I was on there, we were a very small team, 3 to 6 people, depending, as people came and went. And one of the things we noticed as we started testing the waters with code review of all of our changes, we noticed, without really reading a book about it beforehand or deciding we were going to do this, that we would start to have different people in mind for different kinds of review. And I even internally, I had nicknames for the specific teammates that I would tag in. So I would have the legacy expert. When I've got this piece of crufty code that's what is this thing even in here for? Can I delete this? The legacy expert's the one I call in who says, oh yeah, that was used back in the 80s. You can get rid of it now. Or no, I know it sounds weird, but this one obscure model of hardware still needs it, so you got to keep that in. Then there was the math whiz, right? One of our team members has a master's in cryptography. She's the one I call in to ask oh yeah, are we correctly integrating the area under this curve? And then me, I was the API fuss budget. I was the person that people would call in how is somebody going to screw up this function call, and can you make them not screw it up? By doing things like changing the way we pass in parameters, or just style-wise, how easy is this function to use? And so between all of us, each of us had kind of a little role to play. I have no idea what their nicknames were for me, but we all had people in mind to go to. By the way, there's an anti-pattern here too. If you have any reviewers that are kind of the rubber stamp reviewer, where you open the code review and you see 30 seconds later, approved. I mean, maybe, for a typo fix, maybe, right? But if you're no, I really wanted your input, because this affects your system. So that's a pattern to avoid. Please, if you do see a review come back like that, maybe find that person in real life and say, did you have any questions about that code I sent? Or even, I have this concern, I'm not sure that I did XYZ right. Can you tell me if I did? Can you tell me in writing in the PR? Awesome. So when I came to New Relic, this idea of roles in our head became roles that are explicit in the code review. And that was a big revelation for me, and I really dig it. It's one of my favorite things about our process. We're not the only company to do this. I'm sure it was just a nice revelation for me coming there. It was like an evolution of that idea. One step forward from what we'd kind of informally been doing. So this notion of roles become explicit instead of just nicknames we have for each other. They actually become something that is mentioned right there in the pull request in black and white. So the most important one is called the Sidekick, and just about every team at New Relic has a reviewer called the Sidekick. So when I open the pull request in Jeremiah, I'm going to tag you in and say, you're the one who's going to read every line of the diff and say, yep, that looks correct to me. You're going to try it, you're going to grab the code and boot it up and click your way through what I claim I've changed. You're probably going to click on a few unrelated things and make sure I didn't break something that seemed unrelated but actually was distantly intertwined. And you're going to be looking also, does the code look like it's going to perform well? Is it easy to read? Is it well laid out? All those kinds of things. So the Sidekick is the most important reviewer. They're the traditional code reviewer. And on some teams, that's all you need. On our team, it's a pretty big, complex code base with a lot of teams that actually play in it. Not as many as used to, but still. So we have this notion of an anchor reviewer. An anchor reviewer is somebody who's been with this code base for a little longer, and they're not necessarily going to be asking questions like, does this work and does it look good? They're going to be asking questions like, is this a good time to merge this? Are we under a code freeze because, well, for like an e-commerce site, if it's the night before Black Friday, maybe don't change that entire overhaul of the billing system just yet, right? So is this a good time to merge this? Is there something the author of this code, there's no way they could have known, but I happen to know because I was talking to this other person about this system over there? Also, the anchor is the one who confirms what's the risk of this change. We actually label each PR with a sort of a low, medium, or high risk. There are some of our tools that use the chili pepper emoji, which I love. How many chili peppers of spicy is it? So the anchor is like kind of looking at the big picture. And so on my project, every PR has at least 2 reviewers, the Sidekick and the anchor, but there can also be more, and that's where the automation comes in. So when you start a review, you pick the Sidekick and anchor, but then the robot comes in and says, oh, wait a minute, you changed our dependencies. That means we need to tag in somebody to look at the licensing and make sure like we can legally use that code. Actually follow the link to the license for that gem and say like, yep, that's the MIT license, that's one of the good ones, go for it. And so all these people who have very narrow focuses, in our system we call them curators. There's a routes curator. It turns out our customers like to be able to visit the same URL every day and have that still load the same page and not have that suddenly vanish on them. So if you make any changes to the routes, we have a route curator come on, make sure, yep, that's okay. Or like, no, you added this giant wildcard catch-all route that's not going to let us do any new URLs in that part of the site. There are API curators. Oh, you better believe the business people want to read it when we change the financial code. Yeah. So these are very easy to have a robot come and look at the diff and say, what files did I touch? And add a comment tagging in by name so that they'll get that nice email in their inbox. Yep, come review this code. And it was a big eye-opener for me. I really, really like this notion because it lets each person focus on just their piece. The license person doesn't need to verify the code's correct. They can. Sometimes when I have been tagged in for licensing, I've like, oh, let me look at the diffs real quick. Uh-oh. But most of the time, you can just jump in, do your little piece. So I claim that this distributes that time commitment. Instead of having everybody have to focus on all the code at once, each person focuses on a little slice. It becomes more manageable. Certainly, it feels more manageable for me compared to just a broad-based code review. Absolutely.
So you have a robot who makes the decisions, who needs to review it, and for what kind of change?
Yes. So we have a bot. It's not. There's very little intelligence on the robot at all. So the way we have it hooked up is when you you open or update a pull request in GitHub, it sends out a webhook to our bot, and it's just listening on HTTP for these incoming connections. And as soon as it gets one that says, "Oh, this PR was just opened," then it looks at the diff and sees what files were changed. And so if you touch anything in the routes directory, the route curator gets tagged in. So you could probably train one with machine learning, and I noticed GitHub nowadays seems to actually do that for you and start to suggest reviewers, but this one's just very simple logic based on the diff.
So it's very much based on like who owns whatever set classes.
Yes, yeah, it's based on ownership. And yeah, I'm sure it could get more automated of having, actually that question of ownership, yeah. What if the bot actually looked at who had last touched that file and just tagged them at an automatic, or who touches that file the most? I didn't even think about that. But even like this super basic system works pretty well for us.
So is every single change gets reviewed?
On my code base, yes, every single change. So we take these roles seriously because we can now have the time commitment to do them. But just because we do them with care and we do them with attention doesn't mean we don't still have fun. And it's like a big part of this process too is keeping the conversation flowing. And to do that, of course, there are lots of emojis and maybe a little bit of potty humor and lots of animated pictures. That we took out this one particularly problematic dependency that was holding us back from a lot of upgrades. And you had to scroll down pages and pages and pages through all the amazing GIFs. By the end of the time this was done, there was like, spoiler alert, Smeagol falling into Mount Doom with the ring. And it's a blast. So horrible puns, even just messages of encouragement. Hey, thanks for making this change. We've been trying to fix this for a year. Nicely done. A little bit of that can go a long way. So now we're kind of shifting the conversation into that, making things more sustainable and humane. Part of the domain. And I'd like to talk about avoiding burnout and avoiding squabbling in fights. Not that we don't occasionally get a little bit snippy, but there are techniques that we have found that seem to mitigate. Again, one of them being trying to keep the humor flowing, but another being considering the relationship between the author and the reviewer. So back when I was at Tech, at one point we had a team that was split between an on-site and an off-site team, and we had never met in person anybody from the off-site team, and we found out, oh, well, everybody at the off-site team is newer to the company than we are. So how does it sound if you make a change and somebody that seems to you to be a senior engineer says, this won't work? Like, and especially kind of over the internet, it's hard to read tone of voice. It probably sounds pretty harsh. And so knowing then the sort of relationship between most of the engineers on the local team versus the off-site team, and it's like, okay, let's consider the impact of our words. And of course, this can happen even with a local team as well. I've got members of my team who are much newer to programming, and it's the same kind of thing. Instead of saying, this breaks, do it this way. Instead, just turning it into a question. What would happen if we tested this with an empty file? Or what would happen if the customer is not authorized to make this request? Or things like, did you consider case X? Or one of my favorite ones, could you write a test case for the case when ... That's one of my favorite ones, because then you get another test case out of it too. And then they're like, oh yeah, it needs to handle that. So that's probably the number one way to kind of reduce conflict. You can still have a discussion. You can even still have an argument, right? I'm not suggesting we never ever disagree about anything, just that we do so gently and respectfully. But another way too is to have some of those stylistic changes reviewed by robots instead of people. So have a linter, right? If you're in RootRe, you use something like Rubocop. What was the talk on static analysis they did yesterday? Did anybody go to Sonic? Sonar lints, yeah, okay. So yeah, something like that. Let the robot tell you that you messed up your indentation. Bad news is way easier to take from a robot. I wish a robot had told me about my double equals. So so the linters are just a very specific example of letting robots tell you the bad news. And it avoids that kind of bike shedding discussion too. If you have a standard for how you're going to name variables, how you're going to capitalize variable and function and class names, and if the robot enforces it, then it no longer becomes your job to comment on, oh, you don't forget to make your variable name like this. You don't have to be the bad guy. The robot will do that for you. And it also avoids those kind of arguments about style. If you don't have a coding standard, well, I like it better this way. Well, I like it better this way. And now you have everybody arguing again about what color to paint the bike shed. That's why bike sheds are harder to build in nuclear power plants. So there's that phrase, standard is better than better. Enforcing code standards, useful thing. All right, one other thing that can come out of this pull request process, or any sort of asynchronous, feedback-intensive code review style, is encouraging follow-up and enabling follow-up. So when I open a pull review, Moss suggests some changes. Of course, the first and most important thing is for me to actually make those changes. But there's often other stuff to do besides just that. For one thing, if this is a common thing that I'm messing up, or 2 or 3 people have messed this up, maybe we need to put it in our playbook. When you make changes to the system, don't forget to do X, Y, Z. Maybe we need a test for that thing. Oh, if we keep breaking this every time we add this new feature, let's write a test case to cover that. Or another check for the linter, like the double equals case. Or if you're using a statically typed language, maybe something you can prevent in the type system. I gave a talk a couple of years ago about using the type system to try to make things difficult to have errors. Another thing that can help with like the whole like avoiding fights but still encouraging follow-up is if you're a reviewer and it's just a stylistic, like maybe just a tweak to a variable name, oh, this might be a little easier to understand if X, Y, Z, add the phrase not a merge blocker to your PR. Like, oh, not a merge blocker, but if you have time to do, I think it would read more clearly to me as a maintenance programmer if X, Y, Z. And that lets them make the decision because sometimes this is an urgent change that needs to go out to staging tomorrow. This may not be a great time for them to go rename all their variables to something you like, but it gives them the power to do that. But that's another optional, that's another item of follow-up that they could do, right? They could just create a ticket to go fix those variable names in another PR if time is critical. So one last thing on roles, the art of picking a sidekick. I was trying to codify how it is I decide who I'm going to tag in as the most important reviewer on my PR. And I realized I almost do kind of have an algorithm for it. I start with the people who are newest to the team. It gives them a better introduction to the code. They're going to think of stuff that is more different than what I thought of when I was testing this stuff. Not only that, but anybody have those memories of being the brand new on a team and feeling like a little overwhelmed when you're implementing, and at some point you need a break and you need to do something other than implement this big giant thing that you're trying to learn how to do, doing a quick pull request review or two is a great way to take a break from that. So I try to keep my newest devs in mind for sidekicking. And also, sometimes the newest engineers are the most thorough. Like, they'll find the gaps in your testing instructions. Like, oh, I tried this and it's like, oh, yeah. And I also consider if somebody has specific expertise in that system. Oh, yeah, so-and-so wrote the login system. I'm touching login code. I'm going to go drag them in as the sidekick. So it's the newest, most thorough person for the task. And then, on the other hand, I don't want to overload my junior devs by giving them all the pull requests, so I add the clause like that fits our time and urgency constraint. So that's it. The newest, most thorough reviewer for that code, for that specific area of the code that fits your time and urgency constraint. That's how I pick a sidekick. Okay, we're on the home stretch now. Still nobody's claimed the Ruby book. It's pretty good. Myra and Marcin. Yes.
So when the code reviews are of, I can categorize at least for myself 2 types. One is when you are implementing something from scratch, and there will be some infrastructure that is already existing and you are maintaining it. The ownership, ownership came to you and you are maintaining it. The owner is somebody else, some other team manager, and now you are taking up the code and the code is already existing. So I can take out the Ruby on Rails only on my own arm, which I have taken up. So somebody else implemented it and it came to me. So when you are analyzing the code and you got to see what exactly it is, if you are changing something on it, the code review plays an important role for me. The owner is not here, the actual owner, and you have taken the ownership. Now I need to choose someone to help me with better my code. So what are the tips and tricks that you can suggest on easily getting through such roles?
Yes. So for the recording, the question is, how do you track down the owner of, or who do you tag in to review your code when the owner of that system has long since handed it off to you and gone? And that certainly happens in our code base too. We'll have people that have moved on to another team and maybe don't remember that code, or perhaps don't even work at the company anymore. And so I start with like a search, right? Well, who worked with that person? Well, I'll also do the get blame thing, right? Where I'll use my source code control system to find out who changed each line of that file, and I'll start looking until I find names I recognize. And I may go find that person, or I'll just know that like, oh, well, they don't do this anymore, but they're on the mobile team. I'll go to somebody else on the mobile team. So yeah, I'm using source code annotation and sort of personal history to try to track down who's most closely related to that owner.
Catch on any related person on coding so that you can confirm what you're doing is the best.
Yes, if I can't find the author of the code that I'm messing with, then I can at least find somebody who's on the team that they were on when they wrote that.
Dean, are you going to have time for other questions as well?
Yes, yeah, we've got about 6 minutes, so let me sum up real quick and then we'll open the floor. All right, so asynchronous review and automation and role selection bring you scalability, and roles and empathy and robots ironically bring you humanity. So when you have these together, when you have scalability and you have humanity, then you have sustainability. You have code review that you will keep doing. And that's my hope and my wish for y'all. So thank you for coming and sharing the conversation with me, and I hope y'all will ask lots of questions afterwards, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
So while I agree certainly with you that having infrastructure in place and more sort of systematic process how you pick reviewers and such, the most difficult, at least in my experience, challenge was to convey the value and bring the developers so they appreciate and see the value in reviews. And sometimes it takes several months, right? And basically once people get those things, not everyone, but many people I found once they see the value, they just love the process. What was your experience? How would you, I guess, convince people that there is a value in doing those things? Everyone sees the value. That's why they invest time instead of proper staff.
Yes. So the question was how to sell people, how to convince people of the value of code review. So when I was on one project where we kind of had to let those ideas percolate out, it just took time. We did it internally first on a small team so we could kind of learn how not to do it, and then we would kind of share those ideas out, and we'd say, hey, come look at this, and we found things like our bug rate was substantially lower than average, and we made the claim that one of the things that helped with that was code review.
Okay, so you collected some metrics.
We did, yep. So that helped, although the important thing was, it took a few attempts and a few meetings to kind of sell the idea and talk to people, and a lot of it was like one-on-one talks of just going to another team lead and say, this helped us a whole lot with task X. Like before we had this problem, and then after code review, we didn't have that problem anymore. Before we had this problem with new engineers needing to understand the code base, and after code review, we didn't. And we talked about what worked for us, and then we kind of let that idea sell it. We knew it wasn't going to work if we said, you should do this, because we all had like very strong-willed team leads. And so yeah, just selling the benefits in terms of how they helped us, and making it about like our story. Yes?
You mentioned like the not emergency.
Right.
It's like, I think for us, we're reviewing every piece of code that goes in, and we had to come to this balance. It's like, okay, if it's like something small like that, like the name of the variable didn't make sense, like, or you miss something like standard, like you put a period at the end of our comments or something like this, right? We said, you just make that change. You've already done the pull. You've already got the code loaded. It's easy for you to make that change, check in, and tell someone you made it. Did you guys find that line for yourselves as well, or do you keep this distinction of you're the dev, you make the change?
That's a great point. So the question was like, if it's a pretty minor stylistic change, you're saying for the reviewer to feel free to make that change?
Right. It was pissing people off. Like, are you serious? Like, I gotta go pull this again to like do some periods and change a variable length? Like, that was hard for the humanity issue of it.
Right. We've definitely done that on my team, but by kind of prior, like, hey, is it okay to make typo fixes straight to your PR? Or what I've occasionally done, so we do our pull requests from one person's fork into the main line. I've occasionally done a pull request from my fork into that person's fork. So it's not making the change on top of theirs against their will, but it does give them one click, like, oh yeah, Ian fixed my typo, perfect, accept changes. So it's like a PR into their PR, and it gets all very meta. So that's actually my preferred way to handle it, is the PR into the PR. It's more work on me, but it's less work on the author. Yes?
You mentioned the PR bot that you guys use.
Yes.
What is that?
So it's we call it Doppelganger, and it actually has a couple jobs, and I would like to split it up. But one of its jobs is it's just this basic like Sinatra app written in Ruby that just listens on a certain route for the webhook in from GitHub, and then it runs git on the command line to look at the list of files that changed, and then it's like if the list contains this file, like it does regex matching on the file. So it's really dirt simple. And then the other thing that it does is when you open a PR, it kicks off a boot. It actually like installs all the dependencies and boots a little copy of the app with your change. I'd like to actually factor that out into a different project, but baby steps.
Oh, so you actually wrote it's an in-house product?
It's an in-house, yeah.
How would also load that?
What's that? Oh, you'd like the book? Okay. Come up after the talk and it's yours. Thank you.
All right, one more?
One more. Yeah, we've got a minute and a half.
What kind of chat were you using for communication during the code review? Was it just team chat, or was it integrated into
We favor doing it in the web-based tool, because then we have the record of it for all time. But oh yeah, one thing I promised to get back to, I didn't, Jeremiah. As the pace increases, if we start to see too many comments back and forth, somebody will say, hey, let's talk in Slack real quick, and we'll move into a Slack channel, or even face-to-face. We've done that too. Like if it's somebody on my team, I might just lean over and say, hey, do you mind if we talk about your PR real quick? And we'll have that conversation in a couple of minutes, and it's over. And otherwise, we'll get together a quick half-hour meeting, and people are pretty good at running meetings in New Relic. They'll get in, they'll come in with an agenda, they know what questions they want to answer, and they have follow-ups afterward. They taught me a lot about running a good meeting. Yes? We have the same problem. So the question was about the paradox of the larger the pull request, the less of a good review it's going to get. to me, it's totally okay to ask somebody, can you please break this up into multiple pull requests? And certainly my teammates have done that before. I've said like, wow, that's a lot to review. And they're like, oh yeah, I can break that up. And they'll just close the PR and open new ones. So that's my favorite technique for getting a better review, is just ask the person, can we do this in smaller batches? But sometimes if somebody's deleting a whole bunch of old JavaScript or something and it's just 100,000 lines removed, like thumbs up, I will always approve deleting code. All right, thank you all so much.
All right.